The creator of the universe designs gold, silver, and, the most brilliantly colored gemstones in existence. He embeds them deep within the earth, creating these materials of just staggering beauty and durability. And then, according to ancient texts, explicitly forbids his followers from wearing them.
Right.
Like, why would a creator ban the very use of his own creation?
It's honestly one of the most fascinating paradoxes in ancient literature. And it really gets right to the heart of how human beings interact with the material world. When you look at the source material we were examining today, you start to realize this prohibition wasn't actually about the stones themselves.
Yeah.
It was about what the human heart does when it puts those stones on display.
Welcome to the deep dive. We are unpacking a surprisingly comprehensive document today titled The Biblical Foundation for the Adventist Standard on Jewelry. Now, a theological paper on jewelry might sound incredibly niche to some, but what we're actually looking at is it's a masterclass in human sociology.
Totally.
Whether you are deeply religious or just endlessly fascinated by why we do the things we do, the way we adorn ourselves is universally significant. We're going to explore ancient Near Eastern history, early church controversies, the linguistic nuances of ancient Greek, and ultimately how an ancient standard of simplicity serves as a radical counterbalance to our modern culture of constant consumption.
Yeah, the foundational premise of this material is that jewelry is not, and frankly has never been, neutral territory.
Right.
The document attempts to clarify the historical and biblical teachings on adornment by establishing a very specific mechanism. It separates what is strictly functional from what is purely ornamental.
Okay.
But to understand why that distinction even exists, or why a modern community of believers would attempt to enforce it today, we have to completely reframe how we view accessories.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because it turns out the jewelry we wear speaks volumes before we even open our mouths. Let's start right there with that reframing. Because if I look in the mirror in the morning and I put on a necklace or a ring, I am thinking purely about aesthetics.
Right, like, does this match?
Exactly. Does this match my outfit? Does it look nice? But to an ancient Israelite or an ancient Egyptian, that piece of metal meant something entirely different. It was practically a spiritual technology.
Precisely. We view jewelry through the lens of modern fashion, but the historical evidence from the biblical materials indicates a profound diversity of functions in the ancient world. Ornamentation was rarely the primary purpose. The beauty of the metal or the stone was just a vehicle to achieve a much heavier, more significant goal. Jewelry was utilized to impress others with immense personal wealth, to establish strict social hierarchies, to assert political power, and, perhaps most crucially, for religious and magical functions.
You were talking about amulets designed to ward off evil spirits, right?
Right.
Or emblems that functioned as pledges of allegiance to specific ancient Near Eastern deities.
Exactly. When an ancient person wore a specific pendant, they weren't just accessorizing, they were broadcasting their metaphysical protection and their societal dominance.
Which perfectly explains the general pejorative attitude you find throughout the biblical text regarding jewelry. Because if jewelry is a tool for projecting dominance or invoking pagan deities, the biblical God's reaction to it makes complete sense.
It really does. The source highlights a pivotal moment in the book of Exodus, specifically chapter 33. The Israelites have just engaged in blatant idolatry with the golden calf.
Right, the golden calf incident.
Yeah, and God's response isn't just a spiritual rebuke. He explicitly demands a physical action. In Exodus 33, verses 5 and 6, he asks them to strip the ornaments from their bodies. Taking off the jewelry was the required physical manifestation of their repentance and recommitment to the Lord.
And what's incredibly compelling is the archaeological record backing this up. It wasn't just a temporary timeout at Mount Sinai.
No.
The text notes that from that moment onward, early Israelites seemingly abandoned the practice of wearing jewelry. When archaeologists excavate early Israelite settlements and compare them to surrounding Canaanite or Egyptian sites, the contrast is stark.
It's wild, yeah.
The surrounding nations are burying their dead draped in elaborate, high-quality jewels. But the Israelite sites, they yield very little jewelry, and what is found is of noticeably poor quality. It implies a deliberate systemic cultural separation.
There's an entire society rejecting the standard currency of status. And this pejorative attitude, it doesn't fade as the biblical narrative progresses. You see prophets like Isaiah specifically in Isaiah chapter 3 delivering these blistering indictments against almost all types of jewelry worn by both men and women who use it to flaunt their wealth while the poor suffer.
Wow.
Furthermore, look at the symbolic bookends of the Bible. In the Genesis creation account, when God provides garments for Adam and Eve after the fall, in Genesis 3:21, there is absolutely no explicit or implicit reference to ornaments. They are clothed but unadorned.
Right, and then you jump to the opposite end of the timeline, to the book of Revelation. The apocalyptic imagery uses two distinct women to symbolize two opposing spiritual forces. In Revelation 12, the woman representing God's faithful people is utterly unadorned, total absence of jewelry on her body. Meanwhile, the woman in Revelation 17, representing the oppressive anti-God empire, is literally loaded with gold, pearls, and precious stones. The author is using the economy of luxury goods to symbolize moral corruption.
And you can take that symbolism even deeper when you look at the deities themselves. In the ancient Near East, the gods of Egypt, Babylon, and Canaan are constantly depicted in art and literature as wearing elaborate, heavy jewelry. It was the ultimate sign of their divine authority.
Right.
But the God of Israel is never depicted wearing jewelry. He never appears using ornaments, and no prophet ever sees a vision of him wearing them. The text argues this total discontinuity with surrounding cultures is not a mere chance. It reflects the core attitude of the biblical faith toward jewelry.
Which brings us back to that initial paradox. If the biblical stance is so inherently hostile toward jewelry, why did God create the materials? Why design an emerald or a sapphire? The document resolves this tension by clarifying that the materials themselves are not intrinsically evil. Minerals are not moral agents.
That is a vital distinction. God created the beautiful materials, the gold and the silver, so the material cannot be essentially evil. The evil is located entirely in the heart of the wearer. This is why you see highly restricted, yet approved, usages of these materials in the biblical text. God actually ordered Moses to make a dress for Aaron, the high priest, adorned with jewelry. Ancient kings wore crowns. Individuals used signet rings.
But notice the pattern in those exceptions. The high priest's breastplate wasn't his personal property to flaunt at a dinner party. It was a functional, sacred tool used specifically in the sanctuary, and the gems represented the 12 tribes of Israel, not his own personal wealth.
Exactly.
The signet ring was essentially an ancient signature, a functional tool for commerce and law. So the restriction wasn't a blanket ban on shiny things. It was a highly targeted restriction on how these items were used to elevate the self or invoke other gods.
Right. The restricted usage, targeted idolatry, and the projection of personal superiority. The document notes that religious, magical, and protective jewelry was rejected because of its ties to idolatry. And when God asked them to remove the amulets and the status symbols, he didn't leave them with a psychological void.
Oh, interesting. What did he do?
He provided alternative, non-ostentatious symbols. For example, in the book of Numbers, chapter 15, the Israelites are commanded to attach specific symbolic tassels to the corners of their garments. These served as a physical, constant reminder of their holiness and commitment to God's law.
But they were made of fabric. They were utilizing textiles, specifically avoiding the use of precious metals or gems to signify that spiritual status.
Exactly.
There's a profound psychological lesson here. If the ancient restriction was about dismantling the projection of power, how often do we use accessories today to do the exact same thing?
Oh, all the time.
When someone walks into a negotiation wearing a $50,000 watch, they aren't trying to tell time. They are trying to silently establish dominance before anyone even speaks. The ancient warnings against wearing your wealth are directly applicable to the psychology of a modern boardroom.
Which naturally challenges the narrative that modesty codes are just a relic of the recent past.
Right.
There is this pervasive assumption, even among religious historians, that strict standards regarding jewelry and plain dress are simply leftovers from 19th century Victorian prudishness.
Right. People assume it was just a cultural quirk of the 1800s.
Yeah. But the historical section of our source material completely dismantles that idea. It traces the standard back to the earliest centuries of the Christian era, proving it was a foundational element of the early post-apostolic church.
Let's really dig into that history, because we are talking about the first 3 centuries of the Christian movement, a time when they were a marginalized group existing within the hyper-wealthy, incredibly status-conscious Roman Empire. Roman excess was legendary.
Go beyond legendary.
You had elite citizens wearing fortunes on their fingers while slaves starved in the streets. So when the early church fathers write about jewelry, they are reacting to a culture of extreme inequity.
That Roman context is essential. When you read Tertullian, writing around the turn of the 3rd century, he advocates for a just measure of refinement. He wasn't promoting an unkempt or careless appearance. He believes in good personal appearance. But he explicitly argued that Christians should avoid gold, silver, and precious gems.
Hmm.
He viewed the pursuit of these items as fundamentally incompatible with the Christian ethos of humility.
And then you have Clement of Alexandria, who takes an even more philosophical approach. He condemned ornamental jewelry entirely, but his reasoning is fascinating. He specifically called ear piercing doing violence to nature.
Yeah, that phrase, violence to nature, is deeply rooted in 2nd century Hellenistic philosophy. Clement was arguing that God created the human body with inherent integrity and balance. Yeah. To literally puncture the flesh, simply to hang a piece of ornamental metal from it was, in his view, an insult to the Creator's design. It was a rejection of the body as God made it, in favor of a culturally manufactured standard of beauty.
But Clement wasn't just a rigid extremist. He was incredibly pastoral and pragmatic. The Talmud points out that he made a crucial distinction. He argued that finger rings used for sealing documents safe in the house were entirely acceptable.
Yes.
He recognized that in Roman society, you needed a signet ring to secure your household goods and authorize transactions. He was separating the functional tool from the ornamental status symbol centuries before modern churches tried to do the same thing.
He also provided highly nuanced advice for divided households. Clement suggested that Christian women married to non-Christian Roman husbands could wear ornamental jewelry if it was necessary to please their husbands.
Oh.
Yeah, but the ultimate goal was always to gently, over time, draw the husband toward the Christian ideal of simplicity. He prioritized the preservation of the marriage and the subtle witness of a gentle spirit over a dogmatic enforcement of a dress code.
It shows that the early church wasn't just creating a list of arbitrary rules. They were trying to navigate a complex society while holding on to a core philosophy. And you see that philosophy clearly articulated by Cyprian a few decades later. His argument against jewelry was primarily economic. He looked at the wealthy women in the church, dripping in Roman jewels, and urged them to use their riches to help the poor instead. His logic was airtight. If you have excess wealth, it shouldn't be hanging from your ears. It should be feeding the poor.
And by the late 4th century, you have figures like John Chrysostom preaching these fiery sermons on this exact topic. He told his congregation that arriving at church decked out in gold was essentially fighting with Paul and putting their spiritual teachers to shame.
Wow.
He argued that the true image of God cannot be enhanced by minerals extracted from the dirt.
But history is never a straight line, is it? It's a pendulum. What I find fascinating is the cycle the document outlines. These early church fathers establish a fierce standard of simplicity. But as the centuries roll on and the church transitions from a persecuted minority to the official religion of the Roman Empire, it gains massive political power and unimaginable wealth.
Right.
And what happens? The jewelry creeps right back in. By the Middle Ages, the church hierarchy itself is adorned in the most elaborate, ostentatious jewelry imaginable. The clergy were wearing the very gems that Tertullian and Clement condemned.
This shift wasn't just a change in fashion, though. It was a profound theological crisis. When the clergy began utilizing jewelry to project political and spiritual dominance, it completely undermined their moral authority. This is exactly the mechanism that ignited the later Reform movements. When you look at the Anabaptists, the Mennonites, and eventually the Methodists, their rejection of jewelry wasn't a new invention. It was a deliberate, educated return to the ancient texts and their early church fathers. They were attempting to strip away centuries of accumulated institutional wealth to uncover the original simplicity of the faith.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's a pendulum swing. Whenever a community gains wealth and power, the jewelry creeps back in, and then a reform movement has to come along and strip it back down. Which brings us right to the doorstep of the modern era.
Exactly.
Because a modern church looking at this history has to figure out how to apply an ancient anti-status philosophy to a contemporary world where function and fashion are seamlessly blended.
This is where the document moves from historical analysis to practical application. The modern standard, particularly referencing the 1972 Annual Council definition, attempts to draw a deliberate line. It rejects purely ornamental jewelry, but accepts functional jewelry. It categorically rejects necklaces, earrings, bracelets, and jeweled or ornamental rings, arguing that their primary purpose is adornment and status signaling.
But the challenge is obvious. If you enact a blanket ban on all metal worn on the body, you paralyze people. You couldn't wear a watch to tell time. You couldn't wear a wedding ring as a symbol of loving commitment. You couldn't use a brooch to hold clothes together. You'd be living in a state of absurdity.
Right.
So the standard relies heavily on that functional test Clement of Alexandria introduced. Does the item satisfy a particular legitimate need?
And to navigate the incredibly blurry lines of modern fashion, the church utilizes three guiding principles to evaluate whether a functional item crosses the line into ornamental excess. The first, and arguably the most profound, is the principle of simplicity, rooted in the Greek concept of haplotes.
Let's spend some time on haplotes because it is much deeper than just meaning plain. This isn't about aesthetic minimalism, it's a psychological and spiritual framework.
It really is. In classical Greek, haplotes referred to singleness, something that was uncompounded or uncomplicated. When it was adopted into Christian thought, it took on the meaning of singleness of heart, pure sincerity, and an undivided loyalty to God. It is the absolute opposite of being duplicitous or having hidden motives.
Yeah.
In the context of adornment, haplotes means living an unpretentious life where your external appearance accurately reflects a sincere, humble, internal reality.
It means you aren't trying to trick anyone into thinking you are more important, more wealthy, or more powerful than you actually are. You are simply yourself. And that flows directly into the second principle, modesty.
Right.
We usually hear modesty used only in relation to covering up the body, but the document uses it much more broadly. It defines modesty as avoiding excess and extremes. It is about abiding by the limits of propriety so that your personal display doesn't aggressively conflict with the values of the community.
And the third principle is economy. This is essentially the application of Cyprian's ancient argument to a modern bank account. It is the practice of good stewardship. If you understand that money could be used for the kingdom of God, spending exorbitant amounts on ostentatious personal display is not just bad taste. It is a failure of economic responsibility.
Okay, those three principles, simplicity, modesty, and economy, they sound great in theory, but let's stress test them in the real world, because the line between function and ornament is incredibly porous.
Oh, absolutely.
Take a watch, for instance. A $20 plastic Casio watch tracks time. It is purely functional. But what about a solid gold Rolex encrusted with diamonds? Technically, it also tracks time. It has a function. But no one on Earth buys a Rolex just to know what time it is. They buy it to broadcast their net worth. How does a standard based on function deal with an item where the function is just a Trojan horse for an ornament?
That is the exact tension the principles of haplotes and economy are designed to address. The function of telling time does not give someone a free pass to violate the principle of economy or simplicity. If a functional item is designed in a way that its primary impact is to assert superiority or display wealth, it fails the test. The standard requires the individual to critically examine their own motives. Are you wearing the watch to keep an appointment, or are you wearing it to command attention?
Look at whatever accessories you're wearing right now and put them through the filter of haplotes. Is its primary purpose to serve a function or to command attention? And the document wades right into the deep end of these social complexities when it tackles the issue of graduation rings versus military medals.
Yes, that's a fascinating section.
This part of the text fascinated me because it deals directly with the sociology of status. The source specifically calls out graduation rings. It argues that class rings, while culturally accepted, should be rejected because their primary function is to signal academic superiority over those who haven't achieved that level of education. But in the same breath, it cites military medals as an accepted cultural practice. I have to push back hard on that distinction. Isn't a military medal literally a badge of superiority? You are pinning metal to your chest to publicly declare, I did something braver or more important than the people around me. How is that functionally acceptable, but a graduation ring isn't?
It is a highly nuanced debate, and the document's reasoning hinges on the difference between individual self-elevation and civic recognition. The argument is that academic rings are generally purchased by the individual to project personal intellectual status. It is self-adornment.
Okay.
A military medal, on the other hand, indicates a social role and courage. It's an award bestowed by a society to recognize acts of self-sacrifice for the benefit of others.
I see the logic, but it still feels like a razor-thin distinction. But maybe that's the point. It forces you to grapple with the core philosophy. The standard seems to be asking, is this piece of metal uniting us, or is it introducing an unnecessary social distinction? The text emphasizes that at the foot of the cross, everyone is entirely equal in sin and grace. The CEO and the janitor are on the exact same footing. If the only real function of an accessory is to stratify the room, to draw lines between who is smart, who is rich, who is important, then it fundamentally violates the spirit of the community.
Which brings us to the profound dangers of attempting to enforce such a standard. Because anytime humans try to implement a standard, human nature will instinctively find a way to ruin it. Now we must address the very real dangers of adopting this lifestyle. The document is remarkably self-aware about the risks involved, explicitly warning against legalism and pride.
This is where it gets incredibly real. The text starts by making a crucial theological distinction between sin as an act and sin as a condition. We exist in a broken human condition. Simply taking off a gold necklace or refusing to wear a ring does not magically cure that underlying condition. You cannot achieve spiritual perfection by taking off your jewelry.
Right. Removing an ornament doesn't cure the condition. The document argues that obedience in this area is merely actualizing a victory over the acts of sin. It is a physical, external proclamation of Christ's lordship over the exterior life. But the most threatening danger is that a legalistic removal of jewelry destroys the intent. It replaces self-denial with toxic spiritual pride. I'm better than you because I don't wear gold. Legalism breeds a deeply judgmental attitude.
It creates a phenomenon of righteousness by subtraction. You start measuring your own spiritual worth and the worth of others by what you don't do and what you don't wear. And the inevitable result of that framework is a deeply arrogant attitude toward anyone who doesn't perfectly align with your interpretation.
It is a devastating irony. The entire purpose of the standard is to achieve haplotes, humility, sincerity, and equality.
Right.
But if you take off a necklace and then sit in a congregation looking down on someone else for wearing a simple gold chain, you have completely missed the point.
Right.
You've traded a physical piece of jewelry for an invisible crown of pride.
So, what does this all mean? It means if you take off your Rolex, but then judge the person sitting next to you for wearing a gold chain, you haven't humbled yourself at all. You've just discovered a more pious, socially acceptable way to elevate yourself above your peers. It's insidious. True obedience, as the text outlines, has to be a humble offering of love and gratitude, not a comparative metric you use to bludgeon other church members.
And that leads to the most common, logical counterattack leveled against this standard. If you discuss this topic in any community setting, you will inevitably encounter what we can call the house and car argument.
Oh, absolutely. It's the elephant in the room. They argue if we restrict jewelry for economy or modesty, why doesn't the church restrict what kind of car I drive or house I buy?
Right.
A guy can roll into the church parking lot driving a $150,000 luxury sports car, and nobody initiates church discipline. But if a woman walks in wearing a $200 pair of earrings, she's suddenly violating the standard. How is that not just hypocritical, selectively applied theology?
It is a powerful critique.
Yeah.
And the source material answers this directly. The explanation lies in how religious institutions formulate rules based on biblical explicitness. The document argues that the Bible has explicit, specific commands regarding jewelry. God, speaking through various prophets and apostles, repeatedly named items like gold, pearls, and costly array as problematic.
So it comes down to what is literally written versus applying a broader principle to modern inventions.
Precisely. The Bible does not explicitly legislate the ancient equivalent of a luxury car, nor does it mandate a maximum square footage for a dwelling. The institution's position is that it will teach the principles of simplicity, modesty, and economy for everything, including what you drive and where you live. But as an institution, it only legislates and formally enforces standards where the biblical text gives an explicit, specific command.
I understand the institutional logic, even if it feels functionally uneven in practice. A luxury car is absolutely an ornament. It's just when you park outside. But speaking of uneven application, the document also tackles the glaring issue of gender bias. Historically, and let's be entirely honest here, modesty codes and jewelry standards have been weaponized almost exclusively against women. It is almost always women's bodies, women's earrings, and women's necklines that are being policed.
The source acknowledges that historical reality, but it forcefully insists that interpreting this standard as a female issue is a gross misreading. The standard is a human predicament affecting both genders. The desire to project status, wealth, and power is completely untethered from gender. The prophets in the Old Testament fiercely indicted both men and women for ostentatious display.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire deep dive. We know the rules and the dangers, but what is the ultimate purpose of this standard? Why did God care about this in the first place? The text offers an explanation that feels less like ancient theology and more like a radical sociological critique of the modern world.
The document grounds the ultimate purpose in two profound concepts. The first is submission as a form of self-denial. The underlying premise is that God's will is always good. By willingly obeying this specific command regarding adornment and individual practices yielding their personal will, it heals the disease of self-centeredness.
But the part of the analysis that is truly wild is how it connects this to human value versus societal oppression. Our modern economic system is entirely dependent on manufacturing inadequacy. Society ties self-worth to external add-ons, wealth, degrees, fashion.
Right.
The economic system actually needs to diminish our self-image so we buy things to feel attractive or powerful.
The economy requires you to have a diminished self-image so that it can continually sell you the solution to your insecurity.
The document recognizes this cycle and presents the biblical standard of simplicity as a direct countermeasure. Think of modern consumer culture as a treadmill running at top speed. Society says, keep running, buy the next shiny thing to prove you matter. And this biblical standard is simply reaching over, pulling the plug on the treadmill and saying, you already matter. You were created and redeemed. You don't need the shiny thing.
It is a stunningly radical act of rebellion against the entire machinery of consumerism. And this connects directly to a restful life. The Apostle Peter, in 1 Peter 3.4, speaks of a gentle and quiet spirit.
A quiet spirit is the exact antithesis of modern fashion. Fashion is engineered to scream, look at me, notice my will.
Exactly. The text posits that over-adorning reveals an unfulfilled quest for inner peace, a restless spirit. Letting go of the ornaments is an invitation to stop shouting. It is an invitation to find deep rest.
And the document suggests that over time, following this standard literally changes our aesthetic tastes to match God's. It's a recommitment to community boundaries.
Ultimately, the source concludes that this standard is ultimately about the lordship of Christ. There is no secular dimension to the Christian life. If Christ is Lord, he is Lord over our time, wealth, and our bodies.
It is a fiercely holistic view. In an age of Instagram filters and image crafting, this standard is a radical act of rebellion against the beauty industry.
It demands an unflinching self-evaluation. Why do we feel inadequate without our preferred symbols of status?
What a profound journey this has been. We briefly recap the journey, from the ancient functional uses of jewelry through the early church fathers, down to the practical modern principles of simplicity, modesty, and economy.
I would encourage you, regardless of your background, to consider how external items might be serving as a crutch for your internal self-worth.
If the overarching goal of removing ornamental jewelry is to achieve haplotes, that beautiful Greek concept of an undivided, simple, and sincere focus on what truly matters, ask yourself this. What invisible jewelry are you wearing right now? Beyond physical rings or necklaces, what titles, curated online personas, or intellectual badges are you displaying purely to command the room? Purely to command the room. And what would happen to your spirit if you simply decided to take them off?
A powerful thought to reflect on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Tomorrow morning, when you stand in front of that mirror getting ready for the day and you reach for that final accessory, maybe you'll look at it and yourself just a little bit differently. We'll catch you on the next one.